It's kind of startling when you hear that before 1775, like every single Christian mission attempt in Africa just failed
Yeah.
completely.
Yeah, not one survived. It's a stark picture.
And then there's that statistic. Early on, something like 19 out of 20 missionaries heading to Africa died within, what, 2 years?
Within 2 years, yeah, it's staggering. A huge, huge cost.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Today on the deep dive, we're going to look back at the last couple of centuries of Protestant missions. We've got some really interesting historical sources here.
Right, and the goal is really to get the big picture of how this global outreach unfolded and maybe learn some lessons.
Exactly, and we'll kind of frame it around these three big phases or eras that our sources talk about. First, the coastlands, then pushing inland, and finally focusing on these unreached peoples.
And I think, why this matters for listeners today is that understanding these big shifts, these historical trends, it gives so much context for global efforts happening right now.
Totally. You see the motivations, how the strategies changed, the challenges they overcame. It helps make sense of things.
It really does. It's about seeing the roots of it all.
Okay, so maybe a good starting point.
Okay.
A couple of key ideas we should mention up front. There's the Great Commission mandate, right?
The biblical instruction to spread the Christian faith globally.
But what's interesting in our sources is this idea that it wasn't just seen as like a divine command, but something that required using means.
Ah, yeah, the means. Practical steps, organization strategies.
Right, this idea that you had to actively do something, organize for it. And that's kind of where our story kicks off, isn't it?
Exactly. That brings us straight into the first era, roughly 1792 to 1910. The focus, reaching the coastlands of these continents.
And the spark for this, it seems, really came down to one guy.
William Carey.
William Carey, yeah. A really pivotal figure. And the story is fascinating. He basically challenged the dominant thinking of the time, which was that the Great Commission didn't really apply to them anymore. It was just for the original apostles.
Can you imagine? He apparently brought it up to some ministers, like, shouldn't we be taking this message elsewhere?
And they essentially told him, sit down, young man. If God wants to convert the heathen, he'll do it without your help or mine.
Wow, quite the rebuke. But Carey didn't drop it.
Nope. He couldn't convince them face to face, so he wrote this book, An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means. You know the full title.
For the conversion of the heathens? Yeah. It's often called the Magna Carta of the Protestant mission movement, a foundational text.
And in it, he argues for these means. What were they specifically?
Organized mission societies. He saw them as the essential tools, the necessary structure to actually carry out this huge task.
And people responded. Slowly at first, maybe?
Slowly but significantly. Societies popped up in England, Scotland, Holland, then the U.S. The American Board, springing from that haystack prayer meeting.
Right. But it started small. One source calls it a pitifully small shoestring operation.
Definitely humble beginnings. But Carey's influence spread. Our sources mention women in Boston starting prayer groups inspired by him.
Ah, interesting. So they were vital in keeping the momentum going back home.
Absolutely. And eventually, women started going overseas themselves, unmarried women, and by the mid-1860s, they even had their own mission boards, a major development.
I'm thinking about that dedication again, especially in Africa. All those failed attempts before, and then the incredibly high death rate.
19 out of 20 dying within 2 years. It's almost unbelievable.
It really makes you pause. One source kind of puts it directly to the reader like, could we show that kind of commitment today, knowing those odds?
It's a heavy question. It underscores the immense sacrifice involved. But it wasn't just sacrifice, right? The first era also saw the beginnings of, mission theory, missiology.
Okay, yeah. Developing strategies. Who were the key thinkers there?
Well, Henry Venn is a big one. He came up with this idea of the euthanasia of a mission.
Okay, euthanasia of a mission.
Yeah.
Sounds a bit dramatic. What did he mean by that? It's not about failure, is it?
No, not at all. Quite the opposite. It's about the desired end goal. A self-supporting, self-governing, self-propagating local church. The mission works itself out of a job, basically.
I see. So it's about a successful handover.
Precisely. Venn laid out these 4 stages: pioneer, paternal, partnership, and participation. Moving from the missionary leading to guiding to collaborating to eventually just participating by invitation.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. It's a progression towards local ownership.
Right, and the withdrawal from the Hawaiian Islands back then, that was seen as kind of an example of reaching those later stages.
There was another insight mentioned. Hoffman. about the missionary's role changing.
Yeah, Samuel Hoffman, he pointed out that a missionary who starts as a beloved evangelist might later cause resentment if they, hang on to administrative power too long.
So adaptability was key, recognizing when to step back.
Absolutely. So the big takeaways from this first era. It wasn't just about passion, heart and soul, but also strategic thinking, mind and strength.
Right, needing both.
And the mission agencies became the crucial means. Plus, this growing realization that you needed compassion, prayer, and research planning, all aimed at building up that national church.
So working towards that euthanasia, in Ven's terms. But this was mainly focused on the coastlands, right? What about getting further inland?
Exactly. That leads us right into the second era, roughly 1865 to 1980, the big push into the interior.
And the key figure here is Hudson Taylor.
Hudson Taylor and his China Inland Mission, or CIM, that's really seen as the start of this new focus. And his approach was, well, pretty unconventional for the time.
Yeah, he was young, wasn't he? Yeah, and faced a lot of pushback.
Under 30, yeah. People told him it was crazy, impossible to go inland in China. Some even warned him he'd be responsible for missionaries' deaths. Strong stuff.
But he persisted. Like Carey, he had this deep conviction.
Fueled by studying the data, the maps, the statistics he could find. And his methods with the CIM were innovative.
Like using trade school medicine.
Right. Practical service. And he didn't demand formal theological training for everyone. The main thing was that laser focus on the unreached inland peoples.
And the CIM itself, the organization, was different too.
Yeah, more cooperative, servant-oriented, less hierarchical than some of the older societies, and it became huge eventually.
Over 6,000 missionaries, I read. That's massive. But did other missions jump on board with this inland focus right away?
Not immediately, no. Our sources say there was some confusion, even resistance. Existing agencies were busy on the coasts. Why divert resources?
Yeah, I can see that argument.
So Taylor actually encouraged the formation of totally new agencies dedicated to these inland frontiers. He traveled, promoted the idea.
And that led to other groups forming, like faith missions.
Exactly. Groups like the Sudan Interior Mission, Africa Inland Mission, these sprang up with that specific inland focus.
And just like in the first era, there was a big student movement involved here too, right? The SVM.
Oh, the student volunteer movement, yes. Hugely significant. One source calls it history's single most potent mission organization.
Wow. High praise. What made it so impactful?
Well, think about it. In a time with far fewer college students, they got 100,000 young people to pledge their lives to overseas missions.
100,000. That's incredible.
And about 20,000 actually went. The other 80,000 became this powerful support base back home. They fueled other movements too, like the laymen's missionary movement, and boosted the women's societies.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing when these new, often college-educated missionaries arrived, was it?
No, that's a really crucial point. There were tensions. These new folks didn't always get the first era approach, which often prioritized handing leadership to nationals quickly, even if they lacked formal training.
So what happened? Clashes?
In some cases, yeah. The newer missionaries sometimes, maybe unintentionally, sidelined experienced missionaries and the national leaders they'd been developing. They kind of took over.
Ouch. That must have caused setbacks.
It did, unfortunately. It pushed things backward in some places, but, lessons were learned.
So by, say, the 1920s, 1930s, things had settled down a bit.
Yeah, by around 1925, the second era strategy was more established. There was significant church growth inland. And by the 40s, this idea of younger churches around the world was pretty widely accepted.
And then maybe similar questions started arising again, like, do we still need so many missionaries here?
Exactly. Just like around 1865, people started asking if it was time for missionaries to go home and let these now stronger churches lead. Our source points out that long overlap, 1865 to 1910, between the first and second eras was a really key transition time.
Okay, so that sets the stage for the third era, starting around 1934, still ongoing, focusing on unreached peoples. Who are the main drivers here?
Two key names, again, both connected to that student volunteer movement, Cameron Townsend and Donald McGavran.
Townsend and McGavran, but with different backgrounds and focusing on slightly different things.
Right. Townsend was super eager to get to the field, didn't finish college. McGavran was a missionary kid, initially went secular, then came back to missions.
And Townsend's big moment was in Guatemala, wasn't it? About language.
Precisely. He was trying to give out Spanish Bibles, but realized most people there spoke totally different indigenous languages.
And that question someone asked him, if your God is so smart, why can't he speak my language?
That hit him hard, became his life's mission. reaching overlooked tribal groups, translating the Bible into their languages, led to him founding Wycliffe Bible Translators.
It's amazing how his understanding grew, from thinking maybe 500 groups needed translation to realizing it was thousands.
And Wycliffe became this massive organization, thousands of workers focused purely on translation. The source calls having scripture in your own language the greatest missionary.
A powerful idea. So Townsend tackled the language barrier. What about McGavran? What barrier did he focus on?
For McGavran, working in India, it was the social barriers, especially the caste system. He saw that people often didn't become Christians just as individuals.
Ah, right. It was more about groups.
Exactly. He coined terms like homogeneous units or people groups. He realized that faith often spread along existing social lines, within families, clans, castes. Decisions were often made collectively.
So less individualistic than maybe Western cultures assume.
Much less in many contexts. He developed this whole concept of people movements, where a whole segment of a society decides together. His work launched the church growth movement, the frontier mission movement, all focused on understanding these group dynamics.
And there was a big conference later, Edinburgh 1980, that was important for this era.
Yeah, kind of a parallel to the 1910 Edinburgh Conference, but this one zeroed in on these forgotten, unreached people groups.
And a key feature was more involvement from non-Western agencies.
Huge participation from what was called the Third World back then. It showed this was becoming a truly global effort. And the emphasis here, in Era 3, it's less about geography, more about social or linguistic isolation.
Which makes defining unreached a bit trickier, maybe.
It can be more complex, yeah. And maybe this era had a bit of a slower start than Era 2, but now there's huge momentum, lots of organizations focused on these remaining groups. Estimates are around 11,000 or so.
Okay, so looking across these eras, these transitions, they weren't always easy, were they? There were tensions.
Definitely. That's a key point from the sources. Transition periods are tough. People invested in the previous era's work can feel overlooked, maybe undervalued. Strategies get debated. Sometimes there are calls to pull out too soon.
I can imagine that. Hard for someone working faithfully on the coastland to hear the big push is now inland, or for someone inland to hear it's now about hidden people groups.
Exactly. So learning how to navigate those transitions is vital. The sources offer some practical steps.
Oh yeah, like what?
Well, 5 main things. First, really honor the veterans finishing the older work. Don't disregard them.
Okay, respect the past. Makes sense.
Second, educate the sending churches back home about why the shift is happening. Third, deliberately allocate new resources to the new pioneer work.
So put your money where your mouth is, basically.
Kind of, yeah. Fourth, share the new vision clearly with missionaries already out there. And fifth, maintain a strategic balance. Recognize different kinds of work are still needed.
That sounds like really solid advice for managing change in any big effort, really.
It does, doesn't it? And throughout all these eras, these various movements were crucial fuel. We mentioned the students.
Right, the SVM.
Yeah.
Well, the layman's missionary movement was big early in the 20th century. Their focus was getting everyone in the church involved in supporting missions, not just the leaders.
Mobilizing the whole congregation.
And women's movements were incredibly important, especially after the U.S. Civil War. They started loads of agencies for prayer and financial support and sent out so many single women missionaries. Huge impact.
It's really interesting how different groups stepped up at different times. What about movements now in this third era? What defines them?
The big focus now seems to be on adoption and engagement of specific unreached people groups. There's this drive for closure, trying to fulfill the Great Commission by ensuring there's a viable church within every group.
That sounds very focused, very targeted.
It is. And the year 2000 was actually a big motivator for a lot of this. Plus, you see way more cooperation between different mission agencies now.
And more missionaries coming from non-Western countries.
Definitely. A huge shift. The missionary force from the two-thirds world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, is increasingly significant. Initiatives like Adopt a People, the AD 2000 movement, they all reflect this collaborative, closure-focused push.
Okay, so pulling it all together, we see this clear historical arc. Coastlands first, then penetrating the interior, now this focus on specific unreached peoples.
Yeah, a definite progression. And each phase had its pioneers tackling the big challenge of their day. Carey pushing for organized effort.
Taylor looking inland.
Townsend focusing on language. McGavran on people groups and social structures.
And each era learned from the last one, building on those insights, Carey needing structure, Taylor needing to go further, Townsend needing the right language, McGavran needing cultural understanding.
Exactly. It paints a picture of learning and adapting over time.
And for us listening, understanding this history really does give a richer perspective on, well, the whole global religious landscape today and these ongoing efforts.
hmm It adds depth to current events and initiatives.
Which brings us to that final big question, I guess. Is this third era potentially the final era? Could this focus on closure, this global collaboration, actually lead to the completion of the Great Commission?
That's the hope, isn't it? The driving vision for many involved. The idea that planting, reproducing churches in every people group fulfills the mandate, maybe even relates to, prophecies about Christ's return.
But it's not done yet.
Far from it. The sources are clear. There's still a massive task ahead. The call remains, as it says in the Bible, to ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers.
So it leaves us thinking about the scale of what's left and also appreciating the legacy, the sacrifices of all those who've been part of this story over the last 2 centuries.
Absolutely. A lot to reflect on.